Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. For those of you that are already online, it's about creating your workplace response, specifically around psychosocial risk identification and control. So welcome today. By way of introduction, I'm your moderator, David Miller. I'm a qualified psychologist and also the head of strategic partnerships and solutions at AP Psychology and Consulting Services. I want to first, next, and most importantly, acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise the continuing connection to lands, waters and communities. We pay our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to elders past and present. Also want to acknowledge our partners, Ideogen, Lucidity, previously Lucidity, who have newly joined forces with a global regulatory software specialist, Ideogen. So their software solution allows businesses to automate their health, safety, environment, and quality management processes, whilst having a 360-degree view of their safety operations. So welcome, Ideogen, Lucidity, and thank you for your partnership on this. So today's conversation, and again, thanks for stepping into the topic. We'll be together for just under an hour. The aim really is to help our presenters, who I'll introduce shortly, open up the world of risk management conversation and apply some really real-world examples to progress your thinking and ours, and hopefully some planning in responding to psychosocial hazards and risks in the workplace. We'll aim to have a few key questions answered at the end. That's the aim. And so you're invited to really share some of those questions and also some comments within the Zoom chat function, so we can capture those, and we'll aim at the end to pick a couple, if not more, and really share some additional perspectives and get our presenters to share their take on things as well. So feel free to make those notes in the chat box function, and we'll probably finish that up just over past, just so we have time to collate those and pick the ones of impact. So I think the title speaks for itself, but just in case you're still making your mind up, the conversation on workplace mental health and wellbeing continues to mature at a great rate. We've certainly seen this over the last couple of years, but most recently, the conversation is now elevated beyond workplace health and safety practitioners, HR practitioners and professionals, straight to the boardroom, because the implications are now much clearer in relation to how these risks and how this conversation impacts reputation, organisational performance, and also the health of workforces globally. So there'll be more on this to come. So those that regulate, I guess, the welfare of workforces nationally, and we all have our different codes of practice and obligations, they've really set out a clear expectation that workplaces understand the risks faced by their people, that they protect them, and that they have a plan in place in order to do so. So today, we have invited you here to hear some perspectives and importantly share some practical examples, and I emphasise practical examples, and make sense of this on how you may want to commence or even advance and progress your workplace response to address risks and hazards in your workplace. On top of that, meeting your obligations along the way. So we've got two very committed and equally experienced presenters to take us through today's conversation with you. And they partner with organisations every day to prevent and protect the psychological health and physical health of workplaces all over. So I'd like to firstly introduce Arthur Papagiannis, founder and CEO of AP Psychology and Consulting Services. Thank you, Arthur, for joining us. And I'd also like to welcome Richie Rao, Product Director at Ideogen Lucidity. So welcome to you both. And again, we'll hear from you very shortly. So firstly, we're all, hopefully we're all committed to either the conversation, or at least there's an action for each of us to contribute to the work that we'll discuss today. But we're all probably here for various reasons, given the way the conversation is evolving. But I want to start the conversation by really hearing from our presenters why they're really connected to this work, and why they're here today talking about this important conversation. So maybe start with Richie, you. Welcome again. tell us what gets you out of bed in the morning. And, you know, when we look at reducing the risks and harm to people in the workplace, why is that important to you?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, David. Look, keeping people healthy and safe at work so they can go home happy and fulfilled at the end of each day is our mission at Idea Gen Lucidity. And look, traditionally, the health and safety industry has focused on physical health and safety. But with the introduction of ISO 45003 in 2021 and the subsequent release of codes of practice and the changes to the workplace health and safety laws, that's really changed a lot, as we all know. And we have an extraordinary opportunity, I think, to make a real social difference, a real positive impact on society by addressing this huge need that we're seeing in society around psychological harm and psychosocial hazards and risk factors in our workplaces. So I'm really passionate about creating tools and helping organizations with managing psychosocial health and safety so that they can really make a difference and help within their organizations and the wider community in preventing psychological harm in the workplace and really making that difference to the people that they work with within their teams. Since the release of ISO 45003, I've had a lot of conversations with customers and people in the industry. I've undertaken quite a bit of research as well. And one of the main takeaways, I guess, that I've come away with from that is that a lot of organizations aren't really equipped to manage psychological health and safety. They're not quite sure what the practical steps are that they should be taking. And they require sort of more clear guidance on how to put in place the right systems and processes to manage psychological health and safety in their organizations. Another key takeaway for me as well that I've been focusing on is how can we do more to prevent psychosocial risk factors in the workplaces. There's been a lot of focus on treatment after the fact, which of course is incredibly important, but on its own, it's not enough. And I'm working with organizations to try and help them really put in place those preventative controls to manage risks associated with psychosocial hazards and risk factors. So, you know, they can really understand how to do that in a practical way. And, you know, that way, at the end of the day, their workers will be safe and healthy at work and be able to go home happy and fulfilled at the end of each day.
Yeah, thanks for that. Like two things there. One is the connection between the work we do at work and the community and that greater social impact. The other piece, and it's slightly connected to that, how do we equip everyone, because we need everyone on the journey, so to speak, to have the access to the knowledge and also the capability and support in order to make the changes required. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. Now, Arthur, I might just flick to you. Yeah, you've worked in, I guess, this field specifically and founded your business over 10 years ago. So I'm really interested to hear from your perspective, you know, why is it that you picked this path and, yeah, why it matters to you?
Yeah, and thanks for the introduction again, David, and great to hear your words as well, Richie, around this. Ultimately, I care about the mental health of all people. And that is why I ultimately started the business and felt it could make a big impact in this space. I've seen the devastating consequences of mental health more broadly from a clinical perspective and one-on-one, and some of those impacts that can have on individuals, right through to workplaces and the impacts the workplace and the role the workplace can play in contributing to positive mental health of individuals. But also the flip, which has been the impacts. You know, I see myself as an advocate for change in this space, and really have set the journey over the last 14 years to do that. Whether that be challenging organisations, whether that be challenging individuals, whether that be challenging systems and processes in amongst all of that. And I guess they're the things we're going to be talking about today. And I'm sure many of us on here today are advocates for this change. Ultimately, because we know we're contributing to the greater good here. You know, the greater good is the social impact we start to have outside of the workplace. We know if the environments are right in the workplaces, our people go home safe every day and healthier. And ultimately, from a personal perspective, they might be struggling, but the workplace becomes a protective factor. Spend an enormous amount of time at work, and creating those right environments for our people is key and critical, because we know that has a ripple effect. That has a ripple effect, one, to the individual, two, to the workplace, and three, community at large. We know the significant costs and implications of, mental health more broadly, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about some of these things. But ultimately, what gets me up each morning is that, how can we make an impact? How can I make an impact? Whatever that might look like. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Thanks, Arthur. I've also had the privilege of working alongside you earlier than today. So that passion always ruminates and comes through in the work. So thank you for sharing that perspective. I think, in relation to what you said there around challenge, I think, healthy challenge is required, in particular this topic. Any change behaviour, whether it be systemic, whether it be, challenging social norms, a lot of these exist in this conversation. And so I really, buoyed by, the fact that's what it takes, and then that's part of your operating. So these are tough conversations, whether it be at a regulatory level, whether it be with our leaders in organizations, that we need to shift their mindset. So let's stay on the path of challenging and understanding what needs to shift. So thank you for that. So you've spoken about that changing shift, and Arthur, in relation to where workplaces need to face and why this is important, and the personal and also the social impacts of that. But this is slightly new ground in relation to some of the, the way in which workplaces and their leaders see their responsibilities and how that may have changed over time. So just digging that further, why does this responsibility sit with workplaces, and why should they take action to prioritise employees' psychological health and safety?
I mean, it's probably, and many of us have seen these statistics, but it's always worth anchoring back to some of these as to the why. Why are we all doing this? And if we look at some of the stats and prevalence, we know 1 in 5 people will experience a mental health condition. We know 5 in 5 have mental health. The 1 in 5 is the diagnostic side of things, but then we need to account for the other 4, which might be languishing, going through challenges, right through to thriving. We also know the devastating impacts that poor mental health can have on people. And I was just talking to that a tad earlier, but, the suicide rates, and data that have, came out recently, close to 3,249 people took their lives by suicide. That's about 9 people per day, which is, a significant and detrimental impact. And we know 75% of those are male. Out of that total number, even though more females tend to attempt suicide. So at that individual, we can see the impacts of whether that be personal or work, contributing and impacting on a person's mental health. And I like talking to this concept of loneliness as well, and because it's quite topical as well. But 1 in 3 Australians report feeling lonely. If we look at all mental health conditions, one of the biggest contributors to poor mental health is withdrawal and isolation. So this space is something we really need to give some attention to. We're working differently, we're living differently. We've learned a lot probably over the last few years as well with the pandemic and things that have come from that. But how do we give attention to connection? So that's really pretty much at that kind of individual level, societal level. I want to move down to the workplace side of things, because this is ultimately what we're going to be talking about today. But let's not lose sight of the impacts poor mental health can have on our people. I mean, most of us have hopefully seen, but some recent publication from Safe Work Australia has publicised some data on the workers' comp side of things. We know psychological injury claims are close to 4% or 4 times more costly than a physical injury. An average psychological injury claim costs close to $60,000 per year, per claim. and a physical injury around the $15,000 to $16,000 mark. We're expected to see psychological injury claims double by the year 2030. And just in the last 10 years, we've seen it increase by 4% or close to, from 6% to close to 10%. But they make up close to 40% of the total workers' comp claims as well. So the cost is quite huge. So we can see that from a dollar perspective and the implications that can have. But we also know what poor mental health can cost workplaces. And we've probably seen this figure before of about $17 billion. But what is really interesting about this stat is 14 billion of this is related to presenteeism. And when we talk about presenteeism, what are we referring to here is how present are our people each day when they're coming into work. Now, I don't believe anyone's really 100%. We've got life going on, but if I've got a range of things happening in the workplace conflict, consistent change, could be trauma associated with that, poor culture, workload, all those things we're going to talk about today, coupled with what might be going on personally at home, relationships, children, economy. How present am I day to day? Am I operating at 30%, 20%, 50%? So we can see the impact that poor mental health can have on how we present every day at work. And we've also noticed more recently some of the legislative changes. I mean, this is really what's created a big movement and shift. We've been talking about this for years now, 15 plus, physical's matured over time. But the legislation in itself hasn't changed. Mitigating psychological injuries has been a big part of this. But what we've seen across the country is a really spelling out of this and getting workplaces to think about this in a little more detail, giving them more resources around this to think about what does it actually mean? How do we tackle this? What are the things you could be doing to mitigate risk in the workplace? So when we think about all of this and the why, there's so many reasons why. But ultimately, it goes back to making sure our people are safe every single day.
Very good reminder there of just the impact of, in the connection between individual mental health and well-being, but also the role that the system plays, and each of us as members of that, either as individuals and employees in workplaces, but also how do we influence outcomes where we can see these significant and large impacts reduced in some way. But how do we collectively do that is also the challenge of the day. But so thank you, a good reminder there, Arthur. Richie, just throwing to you, you work, I guess, with organisations in a slightly different conversation, but baked around the same severity of impact when things are not tracked and I guess change isn't made. So thinking about how you're working with organisations and the conversations you're having, what are the conversations you're having at the moment? What are you seeing and hearing in relation to what workplaces are asking for in relation to support, but also what are they planning?
Thanks, David. Yeah, look, talking to customers really since that ISO 45003 standard came out and the subsequent changes to codes of practice, as I mentioned before, and the changes to the legislation, there's just a lot of conversations about the amount of change required for organisations and what they're seeing in terms of the day-to-day impact on their roles and the work that they do in their teams. Organisations themselves are much more aware of the need to address psychosocial hazards and risks than they had been prior to the ISO standard being released. And over the last couple of years, you're seeing a huge amount of interest and people trying to gain the knowledge and education they need. Recently, the Sydney Health and Safety Show, the whole theme of it was psychological health and safety, and it was there was a huge attendance at a range of speakers that were speaking. Had people standing room only, so it's something that people are trying to learn about and understand. And I think what we're seeing is that there's this huge need, as we've talked about, and as Arthur's mentioned through those statistics, to address this. But people are actually seeing an increase in the frequency of the impact of these psychosocial hazards in their workplaces and across their teams. So an example that comes to mind for me in the construction industry, there's a national home builder that we work with, and the national safety manager there said there's just been a real uptick, a real increase in the amount of incidents of aggression, verbal abuse, anxiety, and stress. And you can imagine the construction industry has been under incredible stress over the last couple of years in particular. And so it's difficult for safety teams and safety professionals who have not necessarily worked in this area before. It's traditionally been probably a HR function. Health human resource teams are managing psychosocial hazards. They see that as sort of their role. But with the changes to the laws and the codes of practice, now it's also a safety issue, and therefore these safety teams and safety professionals are trying to get up to speed on what they need to do in their organisations to make the changes that they need to protect their workers, just like they have done for physical risk in the past. They want to now do that for psychological and psychosocial risks. The other example I've come across as well is a commercial construction company, and this touches on that point about the confusion around who does what, which team's responsible. The safety manager at this company, her role actually changed recently, and now she's HR and compliance. And so she's now managing the psychosocial hazards that they have and the psychosocial risk factors, and using that background that she has in safety to sort of perform her new role. But it's certainly an area that's changing a lot. And with all of this change, it does create confusion and uncertainty, and people are looking for that clear guidance. They want a clear set of systems and processes that they can actually put in place to make practical, improvements in their workplaces. And that's what we're looking to try and provide today, is insight into how to take practical steps that will really make that difference.
Yeah, you both called out some a few key messages, which is the conversation has expanded, and the attention to it has grown, which is a positive. So we're now looking at the more systemic impacts outside of individual mental health. So that's one positive for me. But just to build on your conversations in the market, Richie, is we're also seeing that in relation to the conversations we're having. We're seeing that the physical safety teams have those expanded duties. They're looking for some support and also trying to align their incident management systems or their physical safety mechanisms for identifying and controlling risk to then now incorporating this other new conversation. So there's plenty more to be done, and also plenty more on this going forward. It's going to take everyone, and I think the key driver for me is how do we all align across a team, those teams of functional professionals, in order to tackle it together. So we just heard from both of you in relation to the positive sustainable benefits of obviously that we're trying to achieve here by having this conversation, I guess, to the forefront. And we know the benefits now, in relation to providing that a safe and healthy environment. It seems like a clear win-win, so to speak. But we all know workplaces operate very differently across industries, across sectors, across size and scale. And then there's maturity. And maturity is really, an important part to this on where workplaces are at. And so depending on all of those factors, we know that organisations that can either protect their people or there's the risk there where the culture left unattended can potentially become toxic and put their people in harm's way. So I want to bring this to life for the discussion for each of you on the call at the moment. Just looking at the latest Court Services Victoria ruling the other day. If you didn't see it, we've just got a couple of images there to remind you, but easily found on Google or in the media. So we had a fine of $360,000 due to an inappropriate workplace culture that essentially contributed to an employee taking their life, which is the ultimate and devastating impact that some of these risks and hazards can play. So they were essentially sentenced in court for failing to maintain a safe workplace due to some things such as high work demands, poor workplace relationships, And the ultimate impact was this led to people reporting feelings of post-traumatic stress disorder, fear, and even humiliation in relation to the way in which they faced into their roles. So in short, essentially, the coroner's court workforce, or some employees within their, it was deemed that they were exposed to a number of psychosocial hazards, including exposure to traumatic materials, high workloads, and again, inappropriate workplace behaviours that led to that ruling. So just wanting to sort of go to our presenters now for a perspective on this. So Arthur, you've worked in this field, as I said earlier, for over a decade, at a time when the working definitions and the way in which we spoke about psychosocial hazards and risks were first published. But we've seen an increasing interest and evolution of the way that we now talk about that, and also within that, the obligations of employers and the types of risks that exist across those work environments. Wanted to ask whether you wouldn't mind bringing us up to speed, essentially on where you see the current ways of working and also interpreting these cases, and also by taking us through possibly an example if you've got one.
Yeah, great. Yeah, devastating to read this and just see the impact that can have on a whole workplace and ultimately an individual taking their life. And you can also see how complex this can be. We've really shifted away from that individualistic view on, just looking at mental health and educating people on mental health, where it's actually something bigger than this. That is one component, which we don't want to lose sight of and on, in creating that awareness. But we know there's so much more at play here when it comes to a workplace setting, and taking a very systemic and integrated approach to this is really key. And it's not ultimately dependent on one risk factor or hazard. It's interconnected. Because if you look at something in isolation, you could say the workload was high, but that in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean a significant risk. But once you start adding a whole range of factors around that, which could be workload, then there's the exposure to trauma, me not feeling safe to speak to my manager, right through to systems and processes failing within that, interpersonal relationships. We can start to see the contributing factors which can ultimately lead to an unhealthy workplace. And this is the journey we're all going on at the moment. This is the journey that all workplaces are really trying to work through and navigate. They're trying to look at, we've matured our journey of physical safety, but from a psychological or psychosocial perspective, we're trying to catch up, and we're trying to learn this. And it's created, as Richie shared, you've shared as well, it's creating tension, but I call that healthy tension, and it's allowing a level of maturity to take place. So we're moving from that reactive space really to starting to think about how can we be more preventative in this space? What could that start to look like? And understanding the concepts and the terms in itself, can be challenging at times. But understanding them becomes really important, because that can start to help shape ultimately then how we respond to all of this. And I know a couple of definitions have been posted here just for the purposes of centering us on understanding what we're actually referring to when we're using certain terms. And often we sometimes use these interchangeably or incorrectly as well. And one I do want to talk to initially is that the term of psychological health and safety. That's pretty much the umbrella term for, creating the conditions, practices, policies that, the workplace will establish to prevent harm of its people, and ultimately protect and support its people. And within that, creating a healthy work environment, both physical and psychological. I kind of call it the systemic impact. There's a range of things that sit within that, and how do we move into that preventative space of creating that psychologically safe, healthy, thriving work environment. Very different to that term, which has created a lot of social media attention, discussion, psychological safety. Now, we hear that term quite a lot, and the interplay between the two, both equally relevant. But when we talk to the term of psychological safety, and we often hear this coined by Amy Edmondson, or, you know, she's kind of led this since the back end of the 90s around this, but ultimately that refers to creating the right environment where people feel safe to share thoughts, opinions, views, without any fear of retribution or consequence. Now, that's one factor within a range of multiple factors. That in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean we're going to create a psychologically healthy and safe work environment. That factor is important because if I feel safe, I'm more likely to share. But there's a whole range of things we need to factor within this, of which one is psychological safety. We're going to talk to the other factors as well within that. But I just want to create clarity here because it has created confusion. Even in the conversations I have with clients day to day, they're saying, you know, we want something on psychological safety and we need to spend some time unpacking what that actually means. So when we talk about psychological health and safety, I talk about all the conditions, the factors that can create that healthy and safe work environment, ultimately, which allows us then to move into the hazard space and understanding what psychosocial hazards are. They're basically any condition that can affect the health and psychological well-being of its people and physical within that. You know, stairs could be a hazard, you know, ultimately. And then we have a range of factors which could increase the risk to that. So I'm going to talk to the risk. The stairs in and of themselves may not be a risk that are in front of me, but when the handrail's missing and maybe a step's missing, that starts to increase the risk. So if we start to look at that hazard, even from a psychosocial perspective, we might say workload. That in and of itself could be a hazard, a high, if we say high workload. Or it may not. It may be that there's a range of factors that contribute to that. So it could be the systems that we have around us. I think I shared earlier, the fact that maybe I can't go to my manager and speak to them about the workload, that then it actually increases the risk to the hazard. So the hazards exist, and ultimately where we're trying to move into is assessing the psychosocial risk of these hazards. So this is where we're looking at duration, frequency, severity, to really understand the significance of this. And if we go back to the case study here, you know, that you just shared, you could see a multitude of risk factors sitting in there. You could see, you know, bullying, harassment, inappropriate behaviors. It seems like the severity, without knowing the intricacies of that particular case study, but people, you know, feeling anxious, you know, the consequences of all of this. But there's a range of factors that contribute to the risk, and ultimately the hazard in and of itself. And ultimately what we want to do, once we've assessed the hazards and the risks, the psychosocial risks, and the risks to those hazards, we want to implement controls. And when we think about controls, we really want to look at that through a framework of prevention, protection, and support. Because then our instinctive response might be to put one control in place, but really the way we need to be thinking about this is as an ecosystem surrounding that potential risk at play. The immediacy might be, how do we remove that immediate risk? So if I think exposure to trauma, we may not be able to completely remove that, but we'll put things in place to mitigate some of that. They're the controls, or reduce that risk. But then we're going to start to think of other protective factors around that. Can we have good leadership around that? Could we have good policies and processes around that? Good governance, how we support people when they have been exposed? Are there any work design challenges that might be contributing to this? And what are the controls we could be putting in place to mitigate or reduce some of that risk? Are there any early intervention approaches that we're putting in play? Are the leaders meeting with their people, checking in with their people around a lot of this? So you can start to see when we look at this, it's really thinking about it through much more of an integrated approach and taking a bit more of a systemic angle to all of this. So understanding these concepts become very important, and starting to think about how can we tackle some of these hazards and assess these risks linked to the hazards as well, and ultimately start to consider the controls we need to be putting in place.
Thanks, Arthur. I think, yeah, for me, great to get on the same page for everyone, again, with the interchanging and the use of these definitions, and just demonstrates the need for more conversation to happen, for everyone to come together on that. I think, you know, they are complex definitions to get around, but once there's clarity, I think that integration is possible. So, yeah, more of this, and certainly more conversations across groups of professionals who look after this particular area. Just a final closing point from you in relation to you have talked around the benefits and why action is necessary. Any final message in relation to you know, why workplaces should exist? Yeah, given the case study in mind, and any closing yeah, point of importance there.
I mean, a clearly defining one is, if I link it to the case study, a preservation of life. You could see, you know, ultimately a work environment which potentially may have contributed to a person taking their life. But the ultimate benefits around this is we create a high level of engagement from our people. If we're doing this right, we create, you know, strong morale. We don't lose people. We don't have high levels of psychological distress in a work environment. We should ultimately start to see productivity gains and performance in all of this. You know, if we're really tackling this, this is what we'll see. I mean, if presenteeism is at 20% in an organisation and we're doing this right, hopefully, you know, we increase to 80 or 90, people being more present at work. And if we're more present and healthier, we ultimately get greater benefits at the individual level and at the workplace level. And, you know, it just makes good sense, ultimately.
Yeah. Keep staying with you here. You know, we've now got a bit of clarity, and hopefully everyone on the call is now clear on you know, how we talk about them and how we define them within the workplace. Moving to really the first step, which is identifying and assessing, and this is one of the obligations. Just really wanting to check in with you, is there a single approach to assessing psychosocial hazards and risks that you suggest you know, provides workplaces and people with the best outcomes? Just any thoughts and perspectives on what you've shared there?
Yeah, look, and I mean, I'll share just some examples of what workplaces can do from a best practice perspective, but we also need to understand, you know, different funding that's connected to this, size of businesses, what people are able to do. But we've seen a big shift over the years in maturity in this space, and what workplaces can be doing ultimately to identify and assess, I guess, the risk in the workplace. We've seen the origins of that predominantly start from Canada. Back in 2012, we saw a range of standards that came about, and that matured into the ISO guidelines that we just referenced earlier, right through to legislative requirements as well. But there's clearly defined, if you look at all the legislative changes that are coming out, a set of key psychosocial factors we really need to be giving attention to. And you can see these on the slide. They're on the left-hand side. They're pretty evident in the case study as well. And this is where it's looking at how do we take a real systemic approach, an organizational workforce approach initially, to understand what could be contributing to, you know, psychosocial hazards and risks ultimately, and what are the things we could be doing to mitigate a lot of this or reduce that risk. And taking that organizational approach can be a really powerful way in us being able to do that. You can see a list of about 13 factors there. They're very common. So ultimately, when we talk about what do you need to be doing, you need to be assessing against these factors as a starting point. You need to go, what is actually happening, and get a sense from your workforce on each of these factors. This will start to give you a good level of insight and a bit of a risk profile at an organizational level and a workforce level as well. So these are quite different to engagement surveys. So this is ultimately assessing risk here. So let's not confuse the two. Although engagement surveys can still give us some important data, and other surveys that exist out there. And we're seeing some shifts and changes in that space to supplement some of the items in those surveys as well. But there's some key things we need to be considering here, these factors here. A psychosocial risk assessment, workplace or sorry, workforce assessment will help us ascertain that and mapping to those factors. Then what we've got is a desktop review of assessment of maturity. Here we want to start to go into assessing the policies, the programs, the maturity of these programs we have in play, and procedures and processes. Because we could have a policy, but not much more is being done by that. Or it could be we have a policy, everyone's really clear on it, everyone's communicating it every day, and we're leading the workplace very clearly through that space. So a review of that and maturity of that becomes very, very important. So we've got the assessment piece, a review of the risk factors within the workplace from a desktop analysis. And then, of course, we want to move into that consultative piece in running some targeted focus groups, consultation sessions to understand, whether it be certain teams or across the business, whether there's some specific nuances or considerations that need to be factored in, because in some teams or functions, they might be exposed to trauma, or there could be other variables that just need to be unpacked a little more. So all of these need to be factored in when we're conducting a risk assessment, which will give us a really good platform for then moving towards what action do we need to be taking at an organizational level as a starting point. And it's a really great place to start.
Thanks, Arthur. I think, yeah, for me, it's, ensuring that that consultation piece is key throughout, because we know that's that involves everyone in the solution for one, but also, provides that the procedural justice in relation to shaping the right solution. I'll just go to you, Richie. Keen for you to share with the audience, how taking a physical risk assessment approach might be applied to addressing the psychosocial hazards and risks that Arthur has just spoken to.
Yeah, thank you, David. Look, when I've spoken with people working in health and safety roles, there's often not a lot of understanding about the idea that you can actually take the same kinds of approaches for managing physical risk, physical health and safety, physical hazards. You can take that same approach, almost the same, and apply that to psychosocial hazards and risks. So once you've completed the assessment of the hazards and the risks that Arthur just went through, you can go about things as you would with a physical risk management process. Critical risk management, so you would create a risk register that lists the hazards, it lists the unwanted events, the uncontrolled risk score, the controlled risk score. You would then look at what controls you would put in place, and you would record those. What are the preventative controls that we can put in place, which might be, say, training, for example, or adjustments to the design of someone's role. Or you might put in mitigating controls and list those in your risk register for things like mental health first aid if an event does occur. But I think that's one of the key things that people have not necessarily understood well, is that you can look at the systems you've already got for physical risk, and that's probably one of the key messages I want people to take away today as safety professionals and working in this, is that if you look at things like bow tie analysis, if you had a vehicle accident and a hazard associated with that accident, it might be vehicle transportation, you'd have causes, you would have things like wet roads or dangerous conditions. You would then put in place preventative controls, right? So you would have things like make sure the tread on the tires is being checked regularly, make sure the vehicle is in safe condition, and then mitigating controls might be things like fire extinguishers. The same bow tie analysis could be applied to a psychosocial risk. You can, as I mentioned, look at the score, both the uncontrolled and controlled score, look at the causes in the workplace that link to the hazard and the unwanted event, look at the preventative controls and map all that out, record it all, have a system of truth, a single source of truth that you can refer to, so that you can prove both within your organization and to regulators that you are doing everything you're supposed to be doing. That's really important too. It's because by going through those steps, in the correct way, by having your safety management system with the correct policies and the various systems and processes in place that I've mentioned, the training, that will actually then have that impact on the safety of your workers, the people on the ground. And as Arthur mentioned, there's hand in hand physical risk and psychosocial risk. They are often linked, and so you'll be able to have this cohesive approach that will address both. So it's an exciting time in a way, because we now have that opportunity within the industry to sort of address this, and we've got the tools really. Now it's just making sure that we use them and we take practical steps forward to make a real difference. I should also mention, we can use things like incident reporting and call out psychosocial factors and incidents as they occur, and then learn through the investigative process what occurred, and feed that back into a process. So just like we would for physical incidents, if something occurs, we try and learn from it, and then that might become a new hazard and a new risk in the register, and then the controls get improved. And so what you end up with all of these controls, preventative controls in place, is a better protective factor, in place for your workforce. So yeah, that's my recommendation really, is to look at those systems that you have. You want your workers to have access to be able to report incidents easily, which we're showing here on the mobile screen. You want to have that reporting that I mentioned, which is on the left there, and that risk analysis piece, and the ability to put in place those controls and make sure you're verifying that those controls are effective, to have that continuous feedback loop. So yeah, if we can start to do that as an industry, I think we'll see real impact on society, as we talked about at the beginning of this conversation.
Thanks to both. I think, connecting the piece there, there must be a process, and both perspectives build around that prioritizing that prevention piece. Just noting we're sort of just over 10 minutes before we're due to wind up. We want to have a couple of minutes of Q&A, but Arthur, certainly sometimes knowing what the problem is doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to convert into that first step, or even where do you start the control conversation. So given sometimes it's perceived as complex or just too big, just wondering whether or not you can sort of share your perspectives on where people can start that control process, and how do they turn potential risks into effective change and to protect the workforce.
Yeah, great, David. I think a working example is a really good way to kind of highlight this, because there are a number of things we need to be considering to make sure we're putting the right controls in play. And I might just pull one out here just for the purposes of demonstration. We see from a lot of risk profiles or assessments, workload is being reported as quite high, and we're hearing workplaces say, well, how do we tackle this? How do we do this? What does it mean? Everybody's different. Everybody's unique. Everyone manages things differently. How do I actually put something in place that can become, a protective factor to our people? What way you like to use is something known as the integrated approach, using 7 workplace focus areas, and they really align across prevention, protection, and support. So you can see the top 3: leadership, culture, and work design are your key ones. They're the ones you really need to be investing in. And that's where we're seeing the big shift across industry, legislative pushes, targeting work design and the likes, because that's where we're going to have the biggest impact. Over the last few years, we've spent a lot more time in that bottom end, the support recovery, or somewhere in the early intervention. Your protective factors is resilience and coping. And then we've got early intervention as well, and support recovery. So if I use workload as an example, people might say, okay, maybe we just give our people more training in how to manage their time better and be more efficient. That could be okay. That's coping skills and resiliency. But we know that in and of itself won't necessarily address the issue. So if I take workload, I do a mapping against all of these 7. So if I think about high workload, what's leadership capability in supporting their people with workload? What's the commitment and engagement from a leadership perspective? Do they know the right behaviours around this and how to support their people? Is there specific training that might be required for leaders in what this needs to look like? And how do we build it into capability frameworks to help them better manage this, if I'm just looking at workload in and of itself? What's the culture around this? This goes to that psychologically safe climate. Do people feel safe to put their hand up and say, hey, I'm struggling? There's a bit going on. We saw it in the case study. Clearly, that wasn't there. People weren't able, or they were, but it was being mismanaged along the way. So how are we creating that right psychological safety climate? What are the policies that we have in place? What are the procedures that we've got in place? How are we helping people navigate change? Because is that contributing to high workload? And then we move into the design pieces, the work design pieces. Are there systemic issues that are contributing? So it's not the volume of work, but it's actually the systems we have that are impacting on the person's time and the amount of time they're spending to manage that. Is there good role clarity in what people are doing in relation to that? Because that can contribute to people feeling like there's high workload. Do we have the right people in the right roles? So you can see those 3 blocks there are really key parts in organizations investing, and that's where you're going to make the biggest impact. Of course, we also want to be supporting our people. So if we think about, high workload, is there any specific training to help build coping, resiliency? It could be training in platform systems, whatever that might be too. How do I manage myself, prioritize, and the likes? That's at that more individualistic level, or what can be done at an org level. Coaching, mentoring around this are really helpful. So we can see that right through to early intervention. What are the leaders or people doing to intervene and check in sooner with their people? How are we having conversations around workload? The appropriate resources for people to access. Are we encouraging additional supports outside of, because it could be the high workload coupled with a few other things that could be going outside of work. And then the support recovery. And, people are we supporting them in the right way? And clearly from that case, we could also see some of the implications of mismanagement around this. So we're investing in the right, trying to make sure our people are supporting their people in the right way. When it comes through the lens of workload. So we can see here workload in and of itself, and let's say reduce the workload. Yes, that is one, but there's a range of things we can be doing that become protective factors around this. And this can often be a really good model and a good stone to go, hey, we've got a couple of things going on. There are some high risk factors here. We might pull out one, could be appropriate workplace behaviors. Hey, let me do a bit of a mapping against this and start to think about some of the controls we could be putting in place across each of these 7 focus areas. Because even if I use appropriate workplace behaviors, saying, hey, let's run a 2-hour appropriate workplace behaviors session. Yes, that can be helpful, but there's probably a whole range of other things that need to be doing. And this just allows you to take a more integrated approach to managing those psychosocial hazards and risks in the workplace.
Thanks, Arthur. I think a great way to think about the next steps, and also applying, a framework that the whole of workplace can make sense of, where the impacts are all of workplace, not just at the individual level. So I think that 2 key themes, just hearing that conversation, integration at all costs, but also built together. So thinking about how HR, workplace health and safety, risk, and leaders can get together around their respective pieces. A good way to think about responding to the risks. We have a couple of minutes left. We've had some great responses and contribution in the Q&A. We're sort of covered off, I guess, in relation to the recent case study, what might be the response. I think you've done a great job of covering off that example as a scenario. So I might just shift to one, but coming to you, Arthur. With the lines of work and home life now being increasingly blurred, and the last 2 years or so have accelerated this, what is your view on how to identify the line between what is a work-related issue and what is a personal and home issue? But also, what is the workplace's ultimate, response that can create the right outcome?
Yeah, a great question. And we know both work and personal have become even more enmeshed today than ever before. But equally, depending on how we're working in those environments, we've got a key responsibility if people are working remotely to make sure their work environment or their home work environment is safe. And equally, the things we're talking about is contributing to making sure those things are in place as per a workplace environment, whether that be ergonomics, whether that be psychological distress that might be going on at home. These key considerations need to be looked at. And more than ever, we're bringing the two together. So yes, we've got a legal responsibility to make sure the work environment is safe, but we've also got an obligation to make sure we're creating that right environment, even if people are bringing in their personal issues, that we've created a protective environment for that. It's not about treating those. If we have someone's got a financial issue, a relationship issue, it isn't about treating that. That's about knowing, hey, what supports could we offer the person that the person could potentially take on outside of that work environment, or other things that could be done in the workplace that could help support the individual around that.
I like that in relation to, the benefits of providing that supportive workplace, outside of essentially specific work, and what are the benefits there. So, what else can a workplace reach out and connect to its people for, and provide that value. So thank you for that. We've just got on 3 to 4 minutes to go. So I might just call the Q&A, albeit one question and answer, to a close. I think that was a great one to finish on. We will commit to responding to everyone's questions and share that in a way afterwards. I think that's part of our commitment back. So let us do that. But really just want to thank everyone for their participation and involvement in today. Certainly your interest in the audience, and also on the topic and the discussion. We hope it continues, and we hope that this has been a source of extra curiosity, maybe motivation, or even confidence in how to take the next steps to build your workplace response. It is a critical job to be done. So hopefully you stay with that. Before we log off, as I said, we will share the presentation following that. We'd really love you to scan the barcode if you want, and provide us with your feedback, either in the chat box now, or feel free to reach out to either AP Psychology Consulting Services or IDGen Lucidity as well. If it's a question about today, or whether or not it's a question that pops up, or a conversation you'd like to have with us in the future. But really value all of those contributions and engagement in the chat box. Let this be the start of your journey. And thanks again, everyone. And really want you to have a great rest of the week. And we hope to see you online soon. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.